If you were invited to play in a professional golf tournament, would you rather have Tiger Woods clubs or Tiger Woods swing? Hi, I'm Greg Kite. You may recognize me as a two-time NBA champion with the Boston Celtics.
Ray Kite was tagged.
Things worked out and got a little laugh now.
Greg Kite.
If I were playing in the championship game, I'd much rather have my teammate Larry Bird's jump shot than his basketball or shoes. But I'm also a certified IUL specialist financial strategist, and I'm here to talk to you and share with you today a little bit about the three greatest strengths of a maximum funded IUL. So what is an IUL? Just briefly, it's been called the Swiss Army knife of financial products, but let's talk about the three greatest strengths of it. One, you got the ability to access your money tax-free. So what will taxes look like in the future? Do you think they'll be lower, the same, or higher? Well, when I talk to most people, they think they'll be higher. So what problem does that cause for us? Well, the retirement tax dilemma is that many of us, most of us, have much of our money in tax-deferred accounts where we'll pay taxes later at future unknown rates. Those type of accounts are IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, pensions, etc. However, there's a better plan with a balanced retirement versus this unbalanced with some tax diversification. Moving money as much as 40%, even sometimes more, into a tax-free environment will pay tremendous dividends for you when it comes to tax time in the future. Another great strength of maximum funded IULs is protection from market losses with a strategy that's called indexing. Indexing is not an indexed mutual fund, it's a strategy. And then with a lock-in and reset method, much like when you use a ratchet wrench, you turn one way and it tightens it, and when you come back, it doesn't loosen it. So you're going to lock in your gains and reset from that start. So here's an example of the returns from the S&P 500 for 20 years from 2000 to March of 2020. You can see in the years with the greens, those were up years. The market was up anywhere from 2% to as much as 55%. And then interspersed with that, there were some down years where the market was down, anywhere from 2% to as low as 40% in the Great Recession. The average return over time was 5.6%. The actual return over 20 years was 3.14%, with an after-tax return of 2.2%. However, with an IUL, you can avoid those market losses and generate predictable good growth utilizing indexing. What happens with indexing with an IUL, which we also call a laser fund, that's our name, our acronym for liquid assets safely earning returns. These products will have a floor, and most of the time the strategies that we use have a cap, meaning that you may not get all of the market gain, but you'll get a good percentage of that. In this example, the floor is 0, which is common with most of these products, and we're using a cap of 11%. So you see in all of those up years, when the S&P 500 exceeded 11%, you got 11% cap in that. And some years where it was up but wasn't quite as high as 11%, you gain 8.9%, 7%, 4.43, etc. However, in those red years, in those down years, you didn't lose any money. 0 becomes your hero. What a beautiful thing. Think about that. Great Recession, 2008, 2009, account dropped 40%. You would be very happy if your account had no losses that year. So let's look at how that ratcheting effect, that lock-in and reset method works. What they do is they take an end date value for the index that your account's being credited to. In this example, we're going to use the S&P 500. The end date value minus the beginning date value, and then calculate the difference, subtract one from the other. And they're going to take the difference in value divided by the beginning value and see what percentage that index rate changes. So for example, if we look at S&P 500 back in February 2019, it was at 2,779 points. A year later, it was at 3,370. Subtract that and you have a change in the index of 590 points. So divide that then to get the percent of index change, and you see that the index rose by 25.9% during that time. Now, with your IUL, you had that cap in this example that we're using of 11%. So you locked in 11% gain, and the index, the reset value was 3,370. So that's your starting point for the next year. But let's say, look at this. What happened in the next year? COVID hit. Things shut down. The market crashed in March of 2020. So the index over that next year was a negative 421. points, which was a negative 15% change. If you had been invested in the market in a market-based account, you would have lost 15% or perhaps more, depending on how you were invested. However, the beauty of an IUL is that you were at a floor of 0%. And so you locked in a gain of 0 and you reset back to the beginning value of 23.86 for the following year. Let's look at some more lock and reset examples moving on from that time period. Between February 2020 and February 2021, the market recovered. The index changed by 564 points, which was a total change of almost 25%. Again, you locked in another 11%. However, like I said, there's varying strategies. There's even some uncapped strategies in these. And with a properly managed, maximum funded IUL, your certified IUL specialist can work with you to make decisions at times with annual reviews as to when you might perhaps use an uncapped strategy. Many people out there who had these policies did in that time, and the index change was almost 65%. And those policies who utilized that uncapped strategy locked in a 59.8% gain. What a terrific return on your money. Finally, the other great strength of accessing your money is liquidity. Now, it's always important with our funds to be able to have liquidity. Sometimes we have money that's locked up where we can't get to it for many years, or maybe something has to be sold and it might take months and months before we can access the money. However, funds in your IUL are immediately available. You can request it and have money in your bank account in the next day or two. So there's different ways to access your money. You can access your money the sad way. You pass on and your beneficiaries will access it that way. You can access the money the dumb way or not so smart way by surrendering the policy and taking the cash and interest gain out. But however, the wisest way to access your money is via what's called policy loans. With policy loans, you're in essence are your own bank. We'll get into a little bit more detail of that, but let me show you an example of a policy loan. Let's say you had $1 million of accumulation in cash value in a policy, and then the index growth in a given period was 10%. It then would grow to $1.1 million. But then you wanted to take a policy loan against your policy of $100,000. Your cash value in the policy would be $1 million, 1.1 minus 100,000. But your accumulation value remains at $1.1 million because the insurance company is using your money as collateral to give you this policy loan. And so if you experience 10% growth on that 1.1, the following year, your accumulation value would grow to $1,210,000. Now, the interest on policy loans can vary. Let's say there was a 4.5% policy loan, which is par for the course, if you will, right now. You would have a policy loan balance then after a year, $104,500. So your accumulated value, your cash value then had grown to $1,105,000 in the following year. In other words, your accumulated value less your policy loan equals your cash value. Another analogy that we could use to help you understand a little bit more about this type of insurance policy is it can be compared to owning an apartment building or running your own business. Let's say you had a 5-story building and you were able to lease out all the floors of that building. It would be a beautiful thing. You'd be getting in lease income, rental income, and you'd be maximally funded that building by maximally leasing the building out. However, can that be done that way? Can you do it all at once? Unfortunately, no. The history of this is there's some timing involved. The answers are found in the tax code. Sections 101A, 72E, and 7702 have been in the tax code for decades, even some of it over 100 years. And then in the 80s and 90s, 3 tax acts were passed that determine how fast you can fund an IUL, how much money you can put into it given the size of the policy, and how much insurance has to be included in the policy when above the cash value. Typically, funding a policy could take anywhere from 3 to 7 years, depending on your age or the amount of money you're putting in. But let's use 5 years, like the building analogy again. So what if you had this building in phase 1, at the end of the acquisition phase, your max funded insurance contract is usually about 1/5 max funded, 20%. So if you only had 1/5 your apartment building rented out, would the business of owning the apartment building be profitable yet? Probably not. However, in the ensuing years, if you could lease out a floor a year, in other words, max fund that business each year to where by the 5th year you had it totally leased out, then you would have the best situation with the profits and distributions from your apartment building. The same thing with a max funded IUL. So whenever you decided to access money in the future, you could access it tax-free for your lifetime. How much, how often, and when you want to borrow cash value. Be your own banker working with your certified IUL specialist, your wealth architect to do this. And your policy will continue to grow through compound interest from that interest crediting that we talked about. And over time, because you've max funded this, the policies can become very inexpensive. For example, not impossible to average, say, 11% return on a policy, and your expenses could be 1% or less over time. Earning 11, netting 10, earning 10, netting 9, and that money actually that you would net, those expenses would typically be paid out in taxes over time. You can look at it one way, that the government's paying for the cost of your policy. Another way to look at it, and as we wrap up here, is when you have, I use a bucket analogy. So in other words, you've got this bucket and you're going to put cash contributions into it. As we showed before with the indexing strategy, you'll also earn interest, which will be compounded. And so how much can you put into this depends on, and how big the size of the bucket is, depends on the total premiums that you put into it. What we do when we set up a max funded IUL is look at what's your budget? How much money can you put into it over 5 years or longer? And then what's the minimum death benefit needed to meet those requirements of TEFRA, DEFRA, and TAMRA? And so what that would look like, again, like the building, you fund someone year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. You've got your bucket full. You're able to draw out income, tax-free income as we needed via policy loans. There are some expenses like we talked about, that 1% that I talked about, which are going to drip out, and but they're really watering that money tree. So these are the 3 greatest strengths of a properly structured, maximum funded IUL. Tax-free income, protection from market losses, and liquidity. I'm curious, comment down below whether you'd rather have Tiger Woods clubs or Larry Bird's shoes. Right now, I'd rather have Tiger Woods clubs. I can't run up and down the basketball court anymore, but I can go out and hack away. My next step would be get Tiger Woods swings, which would take a lot of work. If you'd like to know more about how the laser fund, a maximum funded IUL, might work for you, I'd encourage you to read Doug Andrews' latest book, The Laser Fund. My offer to you is a free copy, a gift for watching this video. You can go to the link below, request your free copy. All I ask is that you contribute to shipping and handling. I hope that the information that I've shared with you today has been helpful and you have a little bit better understanding of how a maximum funded IUL works. I'd love to hear from you and follow along with you on your financial journey. Stay tuned and come back to my channel for further episodes.